The night Lillian Carter decided to confess her feelings should have been the beginning of something brave. Instead, it became the quiet starting point of a storm she never imagined she would survive. Hale Dominion Technologies stood high above Manhattan like a monument to discipline. Its glass tower reflected the restless lights of New York City, but inside its walls everything followed a strict order built by one man, Dominic Hale. Dominic Hale had a reputation that stretched far beyond the technology industry. Analysts called him brilliant. Investors called him unstoppable. Employees called him something else entirely when he wasn't around. Cold. He ran the company the way a general ran an army. Meetings were efficient, decisions were final, and emotions had no place in his world. Dominic believed that personal attachments inside a corporation weakened authority. For him, leadership required distance, and distance required silence. No one inside Hale Dominion ever saw him lose control of his composure. That discipline was the reason the company had grown into one of the most powerful cybersecurity firms in the United States. But it also made Dominic Hale a man no one truly understood. Lillian Carter understood him more than most. She had joined Hale Dominion 4 years earlier as a junior data analyst, arriving with little recognition and even fewer connections. What she lacked in status, however, she compensated for with an unusual level of precision. Lillian saw patterns in data that others overlooked. She solved problems quietly before they reached upper management. She stayed late when systems failed and left early credit to others. Inside the company, people trusted her. Not because she demanded attention, but because she never chased it. Her loyalty to the company had slowly built a quiet reputation. Engineers relied on her analysis during system failures. Team leaders trusted her reports without questioning them. Even executives occasionally requested her work when security reports required absolute accuracy. Yet, despite her growing reputation, Lillian remained invisible to most of the corporate hierarchy, except to one person. Dominic Hale had noticed her years earlier during a cybersecurity crisis that threatened a government contract. While senior engineers argued over conflicting data, Lillian had calmly presented a solution that prevented the breach entirely. Dominic remembered that moment not because she spoke loudly, but because she spoke once and ended the entire debate. Since then, their interactions had been rare but professional. Short meetings, brief acknowledgments, occasional late-night strategy reviews when security threats required extra attention. During those quiet collaborations, something had begun changing inside Lillian. It started slowly. Dominic's focus, his intelligence, and the strange calm he carried under pressure created an admiration she never intended to develop. What began as professional respect gradually became something far more personal. But Dominic Hale never encouraged closeness with anyone, and that was exactly why Lillian kept her feelings hidden for years. Until the night the company celebrated its biggest success. The ballroom inside Hale Dominion's headquarters was brighter than usual that evening. Executives, engineers, and investors gathered beneath soft lights to celebrate the company's newest international contract, a cybersecurity agreement that would expand their influence across several global infrastructure networks. Champagne glasses moved from hand to hand while executives exchanged congratulations. Music drifted quietly through the room, and in the center of it all stood Dominic Hale, composed as always, accepting praise with the same controlled smile he used in every public appearance. Lillian had spent most of the evening watching from the edges of the room. For months she had rehearsed the words she wanted to say. Each time she imagined the moment, fear convinced her to remain silent. But that night something felt different. Perhaps it was the celebration. Perhaps it was the realization that opportunities rarely waited forever. Or perhaps it was simply the exhaustion carrying feelings that had grown too heavy to hide. Eventually, Lillian approached him. Dominic noticed her immediately. Even in a crowded room, he rarely overlooked the people who mattered to the company's operations. Ms. Carter, he said with quiet recognition. Congratulations on the security audit results. Your report was impressive. His voice carried the same professional calm it always did. Lillian forced a small smile, though her heart had begun racing in ways she could barely control. "There's something I've wanted to say for a long time," she replied carefully. Dominic studied her expression with curiosity but no urgency. For him, conversations were information exchanges, not emotional confessions. "I admire the way you lead this company," Lillian continued. "Your discipline, your clarity. The way you solve problems when everyone else panics." Dominic nodded politely. Then she said the part she had parsed hundreds of times. "And somewhere along the way, I realized my admiration became something else." The words hung in the air between them. For a moment, Dominic said nothing. He simply looked at her, measuring the situation with the same analytical focus he applied to business negotiations. There was no anger in his expression, no discomfort, only calculation. Finally, he spoke. "Ms. Carter," he said calmly, "you're a valuable employee. Your work contributes greatly to this company." The pause that followed felt heavier than the entire conversation. But personal relationships between leadership and staff are not appropriate. He continued. "I would compromise the structure that keeps this organization functioning." The response wasn't cruel, but it was absolute. Dominic Hale rejected her confession with the same professional tone he used to decline investment proposals. Lillian felt the quiet collapse of something inside her chest. She nodded once, forcing dignity into the moment. "I understand," she said. Dominic offered a polite farewell before returning to the celebration, as if the conversation had been nothing more than a minor interruption. For him, perhaps it was. For Lillian, it was the most vulnerable moment of her life. What made the situation worse was how quickly the story spread. Corporate offices rarely kept secrets for long. By the end of the evening, several employees had noticed the private conversation. By the next morning, whispers moved quietly through the company's internal networks. The analyst who confessed to the CEO. Some spoke about it with sympathy. Others treated it like entertainment. Lillian walked through the office the following day feeling the subtle shift in people's behavior. Conversations paused when she entered rooms. Curious glances followed her through hallways. Even colleagues who respected her work seemed unsure how to treat her now. Her vulnerability had become public property, but the humiliation was not the worst part. Late that afternoon, Lillian noticed something unusual inside the company's internal system. Access permissions she had used for years were suddenly restricted. Project files she normally managed had been reassigned to other analysts. Even the security review meeting she was scheduled to lead had been quietly removed from her calendar. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Then she noticed one final detail inside the system update log. The restructuring order had been approved directly by the CEO's office, and, for the first time since the confession, Lillian Carter realized something terrifying. Dominic Hale had not simply rejected her feelings. He had already begun rewriting her place inside the company. The morning after the confession, Lillian Carter walked into Hale Dominion Technologies, hoping the discomfort from the previous night would eventually fade into something manageable. Corporate life had a way of swallowing awkward moments. Meetings moved forward, deadlines returned, and most people simply pretended nothing unusual had happened. At least that was what Lillian told herself as she stepped into the elevator that carried employees toward the upper security floors. For the first hour, everything looked normal. Colleagues greeted each other in the hallway. Engineers discussed system updates over coffee. The building hummed with the steady rhythm of a company that never stopped moving. But small things began to feel different when Lillian logged into the network. Several project folders she had managed for months were no longer available in her workspace. At first, she assumed the system had simply updated overnight. It happened often when departments reorganized data structures. She refreshed the system. The folders did not return. Instead, a new notification appeared on her screen. Project Oversight Reassigned. No explanation. Just a quiet change buried inside a routine administrative update. Lillian frowned but tried to remain calm. Reassignments happened occasionally, especially after major contracts like the one the company had celebrated the night before. But when she checked the team's schedule for the upcoming security review meeting, one she had been preparing to lead for weeks, her name had disappeared entirely. Another analyst had taken her place. The replacement hadn't even worked on the project. The confusion stayed with her through the morning. During lunch, she approached Daniel Pierce, one of the senior engineers who had collaborated with her on several cybersecurity reports. Daniel had always treated her with respect, often relying on her analysis when systems became unstable. "Did the infrastructure review meeting get moved?" Linian asked carefully. Daniel hesitated before answering. For a moment, his eyes shifted toward the glass offices where senior managers usually worked. Then he lowered his voice. "I thought you knew," he said quietly. "They reorganized the project team this morning, without telling me." Daniel looked uncomfortable. "I didn't ask questions." The answer felt strangely rehearsed. Normally, Daniel would have explained the situation with technical detail. But today, his tone carried something else. Caution. Lillian noticed something even stranger as the afternoon continued. Employees who normally greeted her warmly seemed suddenly preoccupied. Conversations stopped when she approached shared workspaces. A few people offered polite smiles before quickly returning to their screens. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. No one openly avoided her, but no one lingered either. By the end of the day, another notification appeared in her system dashboard. Several access permissions tied to the company's internal security network had been restricted. These weren't minor tools. They were resources Lillian had used for years during security audits. Without them, her work would become significantly slower. She opened the authorization history. The update came from the executive administration system, approved directly by the CEO's office. Lillian stared at the screen longer than necessary. Dominic Hale had not spoken to her since the night of the confession. Yet his office had already begun altering the structure of her work. At first, she tried to convince herself the changes were coincidental. But the following week erased that hope. Another colleague disappeared from her project team, then another. Each change arrived quietly, transfers to different departments, new assignments, unexpected schedule changes. No accusations were made against Lillian. No disciplinary meetings occurred. Yet her professional world was shrinking piece by piece. What confused her most was Dominic's behavior in public. Whenever he passed through the department, he remained as composed as ever. His tone toward Lillian never changed. During meetings, he acknowledged her reports with the same calm professionalism he showed every employee. To anyone watching from the outside, nothing appeared unusual. But inside the system logs and internal management decisions, the structure around her continued shifting. Weeks passed. Lillian began noticing the pattern more clearly. One afternoon, she entered the company's shared workspace to review a network audit report. Marcus Bennett, one of the junior analysts, greeted her with a friendly smile. Marcus had always admired Lillian's work. "Hey, I reviewed the vulnerability scan you mentioned," he said enthusiastically. "Your analysis was right about the firewall anomaly." His excitement made her pause. Most employees had stopped discussing projects with her so openly. "Thank you," she replied. Marcus leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "I don't understand why they moved you off that project. You were the one who found the issue in the first place." Lillian didn't answer immediately. Instead, she offered a small, careful smile. "Sometimes management sees things differently." Marcus shook his head. "That's ridiculous. You're the best analyst in this department." The words were meant as encouragement, but within days, Marcus Bennett was reassigned to another branch office in Chicago. No explanation, no farewell announcement. His desk was cleared by the following morning. The pattern repeated itself again and again. Anyone who openly supported Lillian seemed to disappear from her professional orbit. Promotions were delayed. Project leaders were transferred. Analysts who collaborated too closely with her suddenly found themselves reassigned to distant departments. The office environment slowly transformed into something colder, not hostile in the obvious sense, But careful, people spoke to Lillian less frequently. Conversations became shorter. Some colleagues avoided eye contact entirely when walking past her desk. Fear had quietly replaced trust. Not fear of her, fear of being associated with her. Lillian tried to ignore it at first. She focused on the work that remained and her responsibilities, determined to prove her value regardless of the shifting circumstances. But one evening, while reviewing internal project logs, she noticed something that made her stomach tighten. Every restructuring order affecting her department had been approved through the same executive authorization code. The code belonged to Dominic Hale. The realization hit her slowly. This wasn't random corporate restructuring. It was deliberate. Dominic Hale was quietly dismantling the professional network around her, not with accusations, not with confrontation, but with quiet administrative power. Lillian leaned back in her chair, staring at the glowing monitor while the office around her gradually emptied for the night. The rejection she had experienced on the terrace now felt like something much larger than a simple emotional boundary. Dominic wasn't just distancing himself from her. He was erasing her influence inside the company. And the most disturbing part was how carefully it was happening. No official complaints. No disciplinary warnings. Just a slow isolation so subtle that most people never questioned it. Over the next few days, Lillian tested a theory that had begun forming in the back of her mind. She paid attention to every colleague who still treated her normally. Every person who offered help. Every employee who spoke to her without hesitation. Then she watched what happened to them. One by one, they began disappearing from her professional circle. Transferred, demoted, reassigned. The evidence became impossible to ignore. By the end of the month, Lillian understood the terrifying truth hidden beneath the company's quiet restructuring. Every single person who tried to help her inside Hale Dominion Technologies was being professionally destroyed. Dominic Hale had built Hale Dominion Technologies on one principle that few people inside the company truly understood. Control was not maintained through power alone. It was maintained through distance. From the outside, Dominic's leadership style appeared simple: discipline, structure, efficiency. Analysts praised his decision-making speed, investors admired his emotional composure, and employees respected the quiet authority that surrounded him whenever he entered a room. But beneath that calm exterior existed a philosophy Dominic rarely explained to anyone. Personal attachments inside a company were dangerous. In his experience, loyalty built on emotion could quickly become loyalty built on bias. Friendships created alliances. Alliances created divisions. And divisions weakened leadership. Dominic believed that a strong company functioned best when every employee operated within clear boundaries. Professional respect was acceptable. Personal closeness was not. That belief had guided every decision he made since founding Hale Dominion Technologies. And it was the reason he responded to Lillian Carter's confession the way he did. After the celebration night ended, Dominic returned to his office long after most employees had gone home. The city lights of Manhattan stretched endlessly beyond the glass walls while he reviewed internal reports on the company's latest contract expansion. For a while, his attention stayed focused on business, but eventually, his thoughts returned to the brief conversation on the terrace. Lillian Carter. Her confession had not angered him. What concerned him was the reaction it might trigger across the company. Dominic understood corporate psychology better than most executives. A single emotional event involving leadership could quietly shift the behavior of hundreds of employees. Sympathy could form. Rumors could spread. Authority could weaken. He could not allow that to happen. So instead of addressing the situation publicly, Dominic made a series of decisions designed to restore balance. The process began quietly. The following morning, he called a short meeting with the company's senior operations director. Restructure the data security department. Dominic instructed calmly. Several analysts have been working too closely on overlapping projects. Separate their responsibilities. The director nodded without questioning the request. Restructuring departments was common after major contracts. But Dominic's instructions were precise. Teams that collaborated closely with Lillian Carter were reassigned to different divisions. Analysts who frequently supported her projects were transferred to new responsibilities. Leadership structures inside the cybersecurity department shifted just enough to break existing alliances. The changes appeared routine on paper, but Dominic watched their effects carefully. From his office overlooking the city, he reviewed internal communications, project assignments, and employee interactions with the quiet patience of someone studying a complex machine. What he saw confirmed his expectations. Lillian's confession had created sympathy. Several employees had begun supporting her more openly, offering encouragement, collaborating on projects, and questioning the sudden restructuring of her responsibilities. The Dominic viewed this as the beginning of a dangerous imbalance. In his mind, emotional loyalty toward one employee could evolve into resistance toward leadership decisions. So he removed the loyalty, not with confrontation, with structure. Department heads received subtle instructions during routine meetings. Distribute project leadership more evenly. Encourage cross-department collaboration. Prevent over-reliance on individual analysts. Each directive sounded reasonable. Each change slowly reduced Lillian's influence inside the company. Meanwhile, the Dominic requested something else from the Human Resources Department. A quiet performance review. Not a formal investigation, just documentation. The HR began tracking minor inconsistencies in Lillian's work schedule, small delays in project reporting, and routine administrative errors that normally would never appear in an executive report. None of the issues were serious, but together they created a narrative of declining efficiency. Dominic studied the reports carefully. To him, the strategy was logical. If employees believed Lillian's professional performance was weakening, sympathy toward her situation would fade naturally, the company's internal hierarchy would stabilize, and the emotional disturbance created by the confession would disappear. But something unexpected began happening during this process. Dominic noticed that despite the restrictions placed around her, Lillian continued working with the same quiet focus she always had. She didn't protest the reassigned projects. She didn't confront management. She simply adjusted to the changes and kept producing accurate reports. Even when colleagues began distancing themselves, she treated them with the same calm professionalism she had always shown. Dominic watched this with growing curiosity. Most employees facing isolation would react emotionally, complaints, frustration, attempts to defend themselves. Lillian did none of those things. Instead, she worked harder. One afternoon, Dominic reviewed a system audit report that had crossed his desk unexpectedly. The analysis identified a potential network vulnerability inside one of the company's new international infrastructure systems. The report was precise, efficient, quietly brilliant. At the bottom of the document appeared a familiar name, Lillian Carter. Dominic leaned back in his chair, studying the analysis more carefully. Despite the restrictions placed on her resources, she had still managed to detect a threat that several senior engineers had overlooked. That detail lingered in his thoughts longer than he expected. For the first time since the confession, Dominic began questioning whether his strategy had overlooked something important. Not about corporate structure, about Lillian herself. Later that evening, long after the office had emptied again, Dominic opened the company's internal personnel archive. He searched for Lillian Carter's file. The system displayed her employment history, project contributions, and performance evaluations from the past 4 years. At first, the file looked ordinary. Strong performance, consistent reliability, nothing unusual. But as Dominic continued reading deeper into the archived reports, a series of internal incident records appeared that had never been highlighted in executive summaries. Security breach prevention reports, emergency system recoveries, late-night infrastructure corrections during major outages. In almost every case, one name appeared repeatedly among the analysts who resolved the problem. Lillian Carter. Dominic scrolled further. One document in particular made him pause. 3 years earlier, a government security contract had nearly collapsed due to a potential network compromise. Senior engineers had struggled to identify the breach source for nearly 6 hours. Then a junior analyst discovered the vulnerability and stopped the attack entirely. The junior analyst was Lillian Carter. Dominic stared at the screen in silence. For years he had assumed her reputation inside the company was the result of steady competence. But the file told a different story. She had quietly prevented several serious security incidents that could have damaged Hale Dominion's reputation. And no one had ever brought those details to his attention. The realization unsettled him in a way he did not expect. The woman he had been systematically isolating inside his own company might actually be one of the most valuable analysts he employed. Dominic closed the performance report slowly. The strategy he had implemented suddenly felt incomplete. Because if Lillian Carter truly possessed the capabilities these records suggested, then the situation between them was no longer just about a confession. It was about something far more complicated. And as Dominic continued reviewing the final document in her personnel file, he discovered a piece of information that would completely change the way he saw her. Dominic Hale did not believe in surprises. For years, Hale Dominion Technologies had grown under his leadership because he refused to let unknown variables control the company's future. Every risk was measured, every strategy calculated, every weakness identified before it could threaten the structure he had built. But as he continued reviewing Lillian Carter's personnel archive late that evening, Dominic encountered something he had not anticipated: evidence that he had misunderstood someone standing inside his own company for years. The deeper he examined the internal reports, the clearer the pattern became. 3 years earlier, during a federal infrastructure security contract, the company's servers had been targeted by a sophisticated cyber intrusion. The breach attempt had arrived through an encrypted network channel designed to bypass traditional monitoring systems. Senior engineers had struggled to trace the intrusion. For 6 hours, the system remained vulnerable. Then an analyst working the overnight shift isolated the attack vector and shut down the entire breach before any sensitive data could be extracted. Dominic had been informed at the time that the issue was resolved by the cybersecurity department. What he had never been told was the name of the person responsible: Lillian Carter. Dominic leaned slightly forward in his chair, studying the archived report again. The document was written in the calm, technical language analysts used to summarize complex security events. But beneath the quiet tone lay something remarkable. Lillian had not simply discovered the breach. She had predicted it. 2 days before the intrusion occurred, she had flagged irregular traffic patterns in the company's network infrastructure. Her early warning allowed her to monitor the vulnerability closely enough to detect the attack within seconds of its arrival. Dominic opened the next report. Another incident. This one involved an attempted ransomware infiltration targeting one of the company's international partner systems. The attack had the potential to compromise a network controlling several major infrastructure facilities across Europe. The breach never reached the public. It never even reached Dominic's desk, because Lillian Carter stopped it before the attack became visible. Dominic scrolled through the report slowly, the feeling something unfamiliar settling into his thoughts: respect. The file continued revealing similar incidents: small threats, large threats, network anomalies that could have escalated into catastrophic failures. In nearly every case, Lillian had been among the first analysts to identify the problem and prevent it from spreading. What surprised Dominic most was how little recognition she had received for any of it. Most of the reports credited entire teams rather than individuals, and Lillian herself never appeared to request acknowledgement. Her work had protected the company quietly, almost invisibly. Dominic closed the document and stared through the glass walls of his office toward the dark city skyline. For the first time in years, a decision he had made began to feel uncertain. He had treated Lillian Carter like a potential liability after her confession, but the records showed something very different. She had been one of the most reliable people inside his company. The next morning, Dominic did something unusual. Instead of relying solely on written reports, he began speaking privately with several senior engineers who had worked alongside Lillian during past security incidents. He approached them carefully, framing his questions as routine performance reviews. But their answers carried the same quiet message. She's one of the best analysts we have. The first engineer he spoke to was Michael Grant, a veteran cybersecurity specialist who had worked at Hale Dominion almost as long as Dominic himself. Grant hesitated before speaking, as if unsure how honest he should be. "If you're reviewing the security department's performance," he said carefully, "you should know Lillian has been carrying a lot of the heavier analytical work." Dominic raised an eyebrow slightly. "Carrying?" Grant nodded. "She doesn't ask for credit. Most of the time, she just sends the results to whoever's managing the project." The second engineer offered a similar perspective. "Honestly, she's saved us more than once. Some of the vulnerabilities she finds are things senior analysts completely miss." Dominic listened without revealing his thoughts. Each conversation reinforced the same conclusion. Lillian Carter was not simply competent. She was exceptional. Yet the quiet isolation Dominic had initiated inside the company continued unfolding around her. Projects reassigned. Resources restricted. Colleagues distancing themselves out of quiet fear. Dominic returned to his office that evening with a rare feeling of internal conflict. His leadership philosophy had always required emotional distance. Personal attachments inside the company were dangerous. But the more he reviewed Lillian's contributions, the harder it became to maintain that distance. Because if the reports were accurate, the company's stability had depended on her expertise more often than he had realized, which forced Dominic to reconsider something uncomfortable. Had he misunderstood the meaning behind her confession? Lillian had never behaved impulsively during the years he observed her work. She approached problems carefully, methodically, always thinking several steps ahead. A woman like that would not confess her feelings lightly. The realization unsettled him more than he expected. For the first time since that night on the terrace, Dominic wondered whether her confession had carried a meaning he had failed to recognize. Perhaps it had not been as simple as he assumed. Perhaps there had been something else behind it. Something he had ignored. Dominic leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting toward the quiet determination he had seen in Lillian during their late-night security meetings. She never chased attention, never demanded recognition. Yet she had remained loyal to the company even while facing isolation inside it. His strategy to distance her from the organization suddenly felt less logical and more personal. Dominic opened her personnel file again, intending to review the most recent performance reports. Instead, a new notification appeared in the system, a resignation notice. Submitted only minutes earlier, Lillian Carter had formally ended her employment at Hale Dominion Technologies. The document was short, professional, no accusations, no explanation. Just a quiet message thanking the company for the opportunities she had received during her 4 years of service. Dominic read the notice twice before the meaning settled into his mind. The woman whose loyalty had protected his company for years had chosen to leave without even confronting the damage he had caused. For a long moment, Dominic remained perfectly still. The office around him felt unusually quiet. And for the first time since founding Hale Dominion Technologies, Dominic Hale felt something disturb his carefully controlled sense of certainty. By the time Dominic stood from his chair, Lillian Carter had already disappeared from the company entirely. Lillian Carter's resignation should have felt like a routine administrative outcome. At least that was what Dominic Hale told himself when the notice first appeared on his screen. Employees left companies every day. Some left for better offers, some left because they felt overlooked, and some simply disappeared from corporate life without leaving a hind to explain themselves. Dominic had spent years treating departures as numbers, transitions, manageable losses within a larger structure. But Lillian's absence did not behave like a normal departure. It entered the company like silence after an alarm had stopped. Her desk was cleared by the next morning. No dramatic farewell. No final meeting. No emotional confrontation. She left behind nothing except a short professional message distributed through internal email, polite, restrained, almost painfully clean. She thanked the company for the opportunity she had been given. She expressed confidence in the team's future. She wished everyone continued success. There was not a single line in the message that revealed what had been done to her. That restraint unsettled Dominic more than anger would have. Anger could be categorized. Anger could be dismissed as emotion. But dignity after humiliation carried a different kind of damage. It made the one left behind feel the full shape of what had been lost. For the first few days after her resignation, Dominic tried to return to routine. Meetings resumed. International contract reviews moved forward. The board remained focused on growth projections and infrastructure expansion. Hale Dominion Technologies continued operating with the same polished precision it always had. Yet something in the company's rhythm had shifted. It showed up first in small technical delays. Risk assessment reports started arriving later than expected. Minor anomalies that Lillian would have usually identified in advance began reaching senior management only after they had already spread across multiple departments. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing dramatic. Just enough disruption to make competence feel thinner than before. Dominic noticed it immediately. He also noticed something else. Lillian had left several projects unfinished, but not in a careless way. Her files were organized. Her reports were partially prepared. Her notes were precise, almost as if she had wanted the next analyst to continue the work without difficulty. But the people assigned to replace her moved through those files with visible uncertainty. What had once looked like ordinary data under Lillian's supervision now revealed layers of complexity others struggled to interpret. The company had not simply lost an employee. It had lost a level of intelligence no one had properly measured until it was gone. That realization deepened when Dominic quietly asked recruitment to gather information about Lillian's next move. The response surprised him. She had rejected multiple job offers. Several competing firms had approached her within weeks of her resignation. High-paying opportunities from respected cybersecurity companies in Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco. One offer included a leadership role she likely would have earned years earlier if Hale Dominion had treated her differently. She declined all of them. No negotiations. No relocation plans. No visible attempt to continue her career elsewhere. Dominic stared at the report longer than he should have. People like Lillian Carter did not walk away from an industry they were built to dominate unless something inside them had already broken. The thought stayed with him long after the office emptied each night. It became worse when former colleagues began failing to reach her. At first, the attempts were quiet. A message from an analyst who once worked beside her. A call from an engineer asking if she would consider consulting on a system issue she understood better than anyone. A note from someone in compliance who wanted to apologize for the way the company had treated her during her final weeks. No one received a response. Her number had been disconnected. Her company email was dead. Even her professional profiles slowly went inactive, one by one, as if she were erasing herself from every network that had once known her name. Weeks turned into months. No one knew where she was. That uncertainty began changing Dominic in ways he refused to acknowledge aloud. It was no longer possible to tell himself she had simply moved on. People moved on visibly. They rebuilt. They joined competitors. They resurfaced in other executive circles. Lillian had done none of those things. She had vanished from the corporate world so completely that even silence began to feel like evidence. And with every passing week, Dominic saw more clearly what he had created. The environment he designed to isolate her had done its work too well. He had not just rejected a confession. He had dismantled the professional safety around a woman whose only visible mistake had been honesty. He had made the company colder around her until staying became unbearable. He had convinced others that closeness to her was dangerous. And when she finally left, the system he built simply absorbed her absence and kept moving. or at least it tried to. Because not everyone remained. The first major resignation came from Daniel Pierce, one of the senior engineers who had quietly respected Lillian's work for years. He cited strategic differences in his departure letter, but everyone inside the department understood the phrase meant far more than it said. Then came two more analysts from the security review team, then a project coordinator who had once defended Lillian's reporting in a leadership meeting. None of them left dramatically. None of them made accusations. They simply exited the company with the same quiet professionalism Lillian had shown. Dominic began recognizing the pattern with a dread that felt increasingly personal. The people most loyal to standards, truth, and technical integrity were the ones losing faith in Hale Dominion, and all roads led back to her. One evening, months after Lillian's resignation, Dominic remained alone in his office while rain streaked the glass walls overlooking Manhattan. The company had gone quiet below him, reduced to scattered lights and distant server hum. He opened an older archive folder connected to one of Lillian's unfinished projects, intending only to review why the replacement analysts were still struggling with it. At first, the file looked ordinary: routine security documentation, network anomaly logs, internal infrastructure audit references. Then he found a locked attachment buried beneath a mislabeled subdirectory, a one that had escaped standard review because it was tagged as incomplete draft material. The encryption signature belonged to Lillian. Dominic felt something tighten in his chest as he opened the document. It was not an unfinished draft. It was a confidential security report. And as his eyes moved across the first page, the blood seemed to drain from his face. Lillian had been investigating a threat inside Hale Dominion Technologies itself. Not a technical malfunction, not an outside nuisance. A real, coordinated security breach moving quietly through the company's infrastructure with enough sophistication to avoid detection by nearly everyone except her. The final line on the visible page made the room feel suddenly airless. If Lillian's report was correct, the threat she uncovered had the power to destroy Dominic's company from the inside out. The moment Dominic Hale finished reading the first page of Lillian Carter's confidential report, the quiet around him changed. It was no longer the ordinary silence of a late office tower after midnight. It felt heavier than that. Accusing. The kind of silence that forms when a truth has been sitting in the dark for too long, waiting for the exact person who failed to see it. He kept reading. That Lillian's report was not based on instinct or vague suspicion. It was built with the same calm precision that defined everything she touched. Log sequences, server anomalies, access, route comparisons, mirrored traffic behavior, privilege escalation patterns. She had assembled the evidence slowly, carefully, the way someone would if they knew the wrong person might notice. They were looking. Competitors had not circling Hale Dominion from the outside. They had already found a way in. The infiltration pattern was subtle enough to evade standard detection. Bits of internal architecture had been copied in fragments too small to trigger broad alarms. Client-facing security prototypes were being observed, not stolen all at once but studied over time. Contract infrastructure maps had been touched and mirrored through disguised authentication paths. Someone was learning how Hale Dominion worked from the inside, and somehow almost no one had seen it. Except Lillian. Dominic stood from his chair and walked to the window, Manhattan glowing below him in cold strips of light and rain. For years he had trusted systems more than people because systems made fewer emotional mistakes. Now, one of the only people who had consistently protected those systems had been pushed out of the company by the very structure he built. He returned to the desk and read deeper. Lillian had traced the espionage pattern across several departments, but the activity never stayed in one place long enough to look obvious. Every time she isolated a path, it shifted. Every time she narrowed the source, someone rerouted access through a cleaner lane. It was a patient intrusion guided by someone who understood corporate defense behavior well enough to stay just beneath panic. That meant the threat was not just external. Someone inside Hale Dominion was helping it breathe. Dominic felt the implication land with slow, humiliating force. Lillian had been trying to solve this while her resources were being stripped, her allies reassigned, and her credibility quietly weakened by executive-level decisions that all traced back to him. He opened the final section of the report and found her private annotations. They were shorter than the technical body, but somehow more devastating. She wrote that the isolation around her had accelerated the danger. Analysts who once helped her verify unusual traffic patterns had been moved. Engineers who understood certain infrastructure signatures were no longer in her reporting chain. Access she needed for cross-division comparison had been restricted at the exact moment the breach became more sophisticated. Dominic read that passage twice. He did not need her to spell out the conclusion. By removing the people around her, he had not only destroyed her professional safety, he had weakened the company's defenses at the exact moment it needed her most. The realization cut deeper because it did not come from accusation. Lillian never used that tone. Even here, in a report that could have condemned him directly, she wrote with restraint. She described consequences. She mapped structural damage. She left the morality of it unsaid. That made it worse because Dominic was forced to supply the guilt himself. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he moved through Hale Dominion's internal systems with a focus that bordered on obsession. He began investigating the findings personally, bypassing layers of delegation he normally trusted. If Lillian was right, then the usual reporting channels might already be compromised by incompetence, fear, or something more deliberate. He reopened archived access logs she had referenced. At first, most of the anomalies looked like noise, the kind of harmless inconsistency large companies generate every hour. But now that he was following her pattern recognition rather than his own assumptions, the shape changed. Repeated credential shadows, mirrored logins from dormant routes, test queries against sealed infrastructure segments that no ordinary competitor should have known existed. She had been right. Not partially. Completely. By dawn, Dominic had also verified something else. The breach attempts had intensified in the weeks leading up to the celebration night. That detail refused to leave him alone. Why that week? Why that timing? Why had Lillian chosen that exact evening to approach him, after years of silence? At the moment the company was celebrating its largest international contract. For the first time, Dominic allowed himself to revisit the confession not as an emotional inconvenience, but as an event inside a larger pattern. Lillian was not reckless. She did not act impulsively. She did not bring feelings into a room unless she had decided the risk was worth it. So why that night? He searched through the rest of the encrypted folder and found a secondary attachment hidden behind a harmless audit label. It contained no technical report, no intrusion map, no server breakdown. Just a short written memorandum Lillian had never sent. The first line changed everything. She wrote that there were things too dangerous to say through normal channels. She believed someone close to executive leadership had visibility into internal reporting pathways. She no longer trusted formal escalation. She needed a private conversation with Dominic that could not be monitored, redirected, or buried by the people around him. Dominic kept reading, his pulse suddenly heavier. She had considered requesting a confidential meeting through security protocol, but that would have left a trace. She had considered going to legal, but legal reported upward through structures she no longer trusted. She had considered sending an encrypted warning, but if the wrong person intercepted it, the evidence she gathered could disappear before he ever saw it. Then came the line that hollowed the room around him. Her confession had not been a lie, but it had not been only a confession either. She had used the most personal truth. She had to create the only private moment she believed she could get with him, not to manipulate him, to warn him. Dominic sat back slowly, staring at the screen as the full cruelty of his mistake assembled itself inside him. He had heard her honesty and mistaken it for weakness. He had answered her courage with distance. Worse, he had used that moment as justification to isolate the one person trying to protect his company from a danger already moving inside it. The emotional damage of that truth was sharper than any public scandal could ever be, because now he understood the look in her eyes that night. It had never been simple vulnerability. It had been urgency buried inside tenderness, fear hidden beneath dignity. A woman trying to tell the truth to a man too disciplined to recognize what was actually being placed in his hands. Outside, morning began to pale the skyline. Inside his office, Dominic remained motionless, the city's reflection faint in the glass behind his screen. For months he had believed Lillian Carter's confession was the problem. Now he knew it had been the warning. And buried in the final line of Lillian's unsent memo was the name of the person she had been trying to expose before she disappeared from his world. The name at the bottom of Lillian Carter's unfinished memo did not feel real when I first read it. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen, convinced fatigue had distorted what was in front of me. But the name remained exactly where she had left it, quiet and undeniable, attached to the last warning she never got the chance to place directly in my hands. Evelyn Cross, my chief legal officer, the woman who had stood beside me for 7 years, who managed the company's most sensitive contracts, who controlled internal legal exposure, compliance escalation, and crisis containment. If Hale Dominion had a second line of power beneath mine, it was Evelyn. I trusted her because she understood discretion, and because in a company built on secrecy and control, discretion looked like loyalty. Lillian believed Evelyn was tied to the espionage network. That was not an accusation Lillian would have made carelessly. She was too disciplined for paranoia and too precise for emotional guesses. If she wrote Evelyn's name at all, she must have followed evidence far enough to terrify herself. I opened the remaining fragments of her memo. Her language was restrained, but the meaning beneath it was brutal. Lillian had tracked internal access anomalies through reporting channels that should have been secure. Every time she prepared to escalate her findings formally, the trail weakened, shifted, or disappeared behind legal routing structures. At first, she assumed it was coincidence. Then she noticed the pattern. Sensitive breach indicators kept passing near the legal office before being neutralized, delayed, or reclassified as low-risk irregularities. That was when she stopped trusting normal channels. That was when she started trying to reach me. And that was when I remembered the terrace with a level of clarity that made my chest feel hollow. The city lights, the cold air, the way she steadied herself before speaking. I had spent months replaying that moment as an emotional disturbance that threatened order inside my company. Now I saw it for what it really was, a woman trying to force a private moment with the only person she still believed might act before the damage became irreversible. Her confession had not been a trick. It had been the only human truth powerful enough to open a door corporate politics had already closed. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, but that only made the memory sharper. Lillian had come to me carrying 2 risks at once. The first was personal rejection. The second was professional annihilation if the wrong person learned what she knew. She still came anyway. She still spoke, and I answered her with policy. Not because I was cruel. That would have been easier to understand. I answered her with the kind of cold logic that lets a man believe he is protecting structure while he destroys the person trying to save it. The worst part was realizing what followed. When I rejected her publicly enough for the company to sense it, I made her vulnerable. When I isolated her professionally, I stripped away the people who might have helped her validate her findings. When I let legal and department restructuring move around her unchecked, I gave the network she had been tracking more space, not less. I had not just missed her warning. I had assisted the danger she was trying to stop. That truth stayed with me through the following weeks as I investigated Evelyn Cross in silence. I could not move openly. If Lillian had been right, then one wrong question placed in the wrong meeting could trigger another cleanup before I reached the core of it. So I watched. I reviewed transaction routes, legal interventions, contract red lines, dispute suppressions, and delayed internal escalations. Once I looked through Lillian's lens instead of my own, the pattern emerged with devastating elegance. Evelyn had not been stealing information herself. She had been protecting the people who were. She rerouted legal exposure. She buried internal flags beneath privilege. She slowed external disclosure just long enough for competitors to absorb what they needed and disappear behind shell firms and consulting fronts. She was not the hand reaching into the vault. She was the one turning off the lights. And without Lillian inside the company, the network became bolder. That was the next cruelty. After her departure, breach attempts did not lessen. They accelerated. Prototype modeling was mirrored more aggressively. Vendor negotiations began collapsing in ways that suggested outside firms already knew our pricing thresholds. 2 confidential acquisitions failed after counterparties mysteriously gained leverage they should never have possessed. It was as if Lillian's disappearance had removed the final piece of resistance from a machine that was already in motion. I began seeing her absence everywhere, in reports that arrived too late, in analysts too afraid to challenge neat explanations, in executives who preferred polished certainty to uncomfortable truth. But mostly I saw it in myself. I had built a leadership philosophy around emotional distance because distance made power feel clean. Distance prevented weakness. Distance protected hierarchy. That was what I believed. Now all I could see was that distance had made me blind. It blinded me to the most loyal person in the company. It blinded me to the cost of humiliation when inflicted through silence. It blinded me to the fact that not every confession is a disruption. Some are warnings wrapped in the only language courage can find. Months passed with no sign of Lillian Cloyer. No public trace. No private message. By then, the federal groundwork around Hale Dominion had begun shifting quietly under information I could not yet prove without exposing everything at once. I kept moving carefully, slowly, trying to dismantle what I should have stopped much earlier. Then, late one evening, while Manhattan glowed in cold rain beyond my office windows, my private encrypted inbox received a message from an unknown sender. No subject line, no rotting identity, just a single attached file. I stared at it for a long time before opening the metadata. The encryption signature stopped my breath. I knew it immediately. It belonged to Lillian Dye. The file name contained only 4 words for when you understand. I stared at the file for a long time before opening it. The encryption signature alone told me everything I needed to know about its origin. Lillian Carter had written it. The precision of the security structure, the way the code folded into itself like a quiet lock only she could design, it carried the same careful intelligence that had protected my company for years while I barely noticed. The file opened slowly. That what unfolded on the screen was not just a warning, it was the complete map of the conspiracy that had been growing inside Hale Dominion Technologies. Lillian had left nothing unfinished. Every network anomaly she tracked was documented. Every compromised server path was labeled. Internal communications between third-party shell companies and Hale Dominion's legal office were preserved in encrypted fragments. There were financial trails connecting offshore consulting firms to individuals inside the company's leadership structure. And at the center of it all stood the name I already feared, Evelyn Cross. The file revealed how she had been shielding the network for years. Competitors never needed to hack Hale Dominion directly because Evelyn quietly redirected sensitive legal reports before they reached me. She delayed breach disclosures, buried compliance concerns, and manipulated internal investigations just enough to protect the people stealing my company's most valuable innovations. But the most shocking part wasn't the conspiracy itself. It was how long Lillian had been fighting it alone. Her final report contained months of evidence gathered while she was already being isolated inside the company. Every line of code, every system trace, every financial connection had been assembled while the professional ground beneath her was collapsing. While I was dismantling her influence inside the company, she was still protecting it. For several minutes I couldn't move. The quiet hum of the office servers filled the room while the weight of that truth settled slowly inside me. Then I began acting. The first call went to federal authorities. The evidence Lillian had collected was too extensive for internal discipline. This wasn't corporate misconduct anymore. It was international industrial espionage involving stolen infrastructure technology and compromised security contracts tied to government partners. Within days, investigators quietly entered the company. They didn't arrive with flashing lights or dramatic arrests. Instead, they worked through encrypted warrants, financial subpoenas, and controlled system access. Hale Dominion's leadership meetings suddenly filled with unfamiliar legal observers. Evelyn Cross remained composed through the first stage of the investigation. She always had been composed. But composure is fragile when the truth arrives with evidence no one can erase 3 weeks later. She was escorted out of the building by federal investigators. The news traveled through the company like a shockwave. For the first time in years, the carefully polished structure of Hale Dominion Technologies cracked open in front of its employees. Executives who had quietly supported Evelyn's legal maneuvers suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Contracts she had protected were re-examined. Entire departments began restructuring overnight. I removed half the senior leadership within a month. Not dramatically, not emotionally. Just the quiet administrative corrections that should have happened much earlier. The investigation confirmed what Lillian's file already proved. She had never been the liability I treated her as. She had been the only person inside Hale Dominion who understood the danger early enough to stop it. When federal investigators finished reviewing her evidence, that one of them said something that stayed with me longer than the arrests. "You were lucky someone like her worked here." Lucky. The word sounded almost cruel, because luck suggested coincidence. What Lillian had done wasn't luck, it was loyalty. And I had answered that loyalty with isolation. As the months passed and the investigation spread across multiple corporate networks, Hale Dominion slowly stabilized again. Investors regained confidence. Contracts survived the scandal. Analysts rebuilt the security divisions that had weakened after Lillian's departure. From the outside, the company looked as powerful as it always had. But inside my own thoughts, something had changed permanently. I tried to find her. Quietly at first, then more openly. I asked recruiters, former colleagues, even investigators who had reviewed her evidence. No one had seen her after the resignation. No company had hired her. No consulting firm had contracted her work. It was as if she had stepped completely outside the world she once dominated. And maybe she had, because the corporate world had already shown her exactly how it rewarded honesty. Months later, on a quiet evening long after the investigation ended, I walked through the cybersecurity department after most employees had gone home. The office still carried the faint hum of servers and monitors. But one space remained unchanged. Lillian Carter's old desk. No one had claimed it permanently. Analysts rotated through the area when projects required extra space, but something about that corner of the room still felt untouched. I stood there for a long time. The same desk where she once worked quietly while protecting a company that barely noticed her. The same place where colleagues once gathered to ask for her help, and the same place where she slowly became invisible after I decided emotional distance mattered more than understanding. I thought about the Terrace again. The moment she trusted me with something personal. The moment I answered with cold logic instead of curiosity. That moment had shaped everything that followed. Not because she confessed, but because I refused to see what she was trying to protect. The city lights outside the office windows reflected softly across the glass walls as the building settled into silence. For the first time in years, the emptiness of the office felt like a lesson instead of a victory, because power teaches you how to control people, but regret teaches you how easily loyalty can disappear when you fail to recognize it. I rested my hand lightly on the edge of her empty desk, and in that quiet space, I finally understood something no leadership philosophy had ever taught me. Some people do not leave because they are weak. They leave because the truth they carried was too heavy for anyone else to understand. And sometimes, the only person who realizes their value is the one who drove them away. If story had touched your heart, then like and subscribe the channel and share it or friends. Bless you all, my family.